Well, hi there and hello once again to all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTube subscribers, and thanks for your continuing support on making my channel one of the most popular classic dirt bike channels on the internet. Now, in my last video posting before the 2019 winter break, we're going to take a look at a few of those classic British Greeves machines. So we're going to take a look at a few Greeves Challengers and a few Greeves Griffon machines. So I hope you'll stay with me for the next few minutes. So without further ado, let's get right in to our first machine. Now, first up, we're going to take a look at Mike George's 1965 250 Mark III Greeves Challenger. Now, this particular bike was Mike's first ever motocross machine when he was just 18 years old, and a few years after racing this bike, Mike then took the entire bike apart and placed every bit and piece of the bike into boxes, and then placed the entire bike in his attic, where the parts then lay for the next 40 years. Now, of course, as these things normally happen, when Mike got into his later years, he thought it was about time to bring his old race bike back to life, and it was then that he decided to do a full nut and bolt restoration on his old scrambler. Now, of course, to start with, the frame was blasted and then painted, although the actual colour scheme of the bike was copied from a picture that Mike had of British motocross rider Alan Clough, and it was one of Mike's friends, Chris Ginn, who copied the original colour on the photograph to make this very nice period correct Greeves green. Now, this bike still has its original wheels, and they were still in very good condition, although they were completely refurbished and then respoked before being refitted to these original refurbished hubs. Now, of course, these are not the original handlebars for the 65 Greeves Challenger, but Mike still has the original bars from this bike, but he had to use a pair of these Renthals, as his originals were being used on one of Mike's other race bikes. Now, needless to say, when it came to the motor, this was completely stripped down, and every single seal, gasket and bearing was also renewed. A rebore obviously was also carried out, and a new piston, etc. was then fitted. And as you can see, the paint finish on this particular bike is absolutely first class and period correct from 1965. Of course, as mentioned previously, the original wheels were refurbished along with these front and rear brake hubs. And it's good to see that Mike has kept the period correct Amal monoblock carburetor on his restored machine. Now, you've more than likely guessed that this exhaust system is not the original for a 65 Greeves Challenger, and that's mainly because Mike has the original system being refurbished, and Mike actually made this pipe to enable him to take part in the race event where I managed to get these pictures of the bike. Now, the old points ignition system was also changed for a more modern electronic ignition system. Now, these rear shocks are a pair of period correct Girling shocks, and of course these are not the originals from back in the day, but these are period correct classic replacements, which look very nice on this recently restored machine. Although apart from the replacement handlebars and this non-standard exhaust system, this is a very nice bike, and it's been very well restored. And once Mike gets the original exhaust back on the bike and the period correct handlebars on the front, this will look like a stunning restoration of one of these old 1965 Greeves Challengers. Okay, our next machine is Richard Winn's beautiful 1969 380 Greeves Griffon Twinport. Now these Greeves Griffons were the replacement bikes for the previous seen Challenger models. Now Richard rode this bike some years ago, although with the many commitments that Richard has in his daily life now, he very seldom has the time to race his old Griffon. Now this bike is not a restoration and is surprisingly in almost its 1969 standard configuration. Now 1969 was of course when Greeves dropped their old I-beam bolt together chassis for this more modern Reynolds 531 chrome molly frame with its conventional down tube arrangement. Now in 1969 these Greeves Griffons were fitted with a pair of conventional suspension units from Sariani. If you remember, the previous Challenger model had that very radical leading link suspension system. Now, these 69 Griffons were also fitted with conical front and rear brake hubs. Now the Griffon's fuel tank of course was made of fiberglass, and it's very rare to find one of these Griffons with their original fuel tanks. Because these were made of fiberglass, they tended to get broken or damaged, but this particular bike of Richard still has its original 69 fiberglass fuel tank. And if I remember correctly, these side panels were also made of fiberglass, and it's very rare to find a pair of these fiberglass panels for a 69 Griffon. Now the full up weight of the 69 Griffon was about 227 pounds, which surprisingly it was about 8 pounds lighter than the old Challenger model that went previously. And it was also 20 pounds lighter than the current CZ model from that same year. Now of course the gearbox and motor were separate from each other on this bike, but were still connected by a primary chain, although this 380 motor was still as light as the previous year's 250 engine. Now the very large cooling fins on this 380 motor were very generous to say the least for its time, although that was because this bike was actually aimed at the American market and their big demand for bikes to do desert racing, and so these big cooling fins were designed to improve the temperature of the motor. Now these bikes of course would have been fitted with an Amal monoblock carburetor originally, although many owners soon changed these to these more tunable concentric carburetors. but nevertheless this is a very fine example of one of these 1969 Twinport Greeves Griffon bikes, and this bike has all the period correct parts from 1969, including those lovely twin tailpipes that go into that single exhaust silencer system. Now, of course, back in the day these would have been very quick bikes for their time if you got the right rider on board, of course, and once you got these Greeves Griffons running good, they were very quick bikes on the track. And for me personally, as aesthetic looks go, I think this is a very nice looking motorcycle when you consider this was 1969. And this red and yellow colour scheme with the nicely polished alloy mudguards and this lovely swing arm and chrome molly frame just complement the bike's looks. Seriani forks, of course, on the front with those lovely twin port exhausts coming from the front of that cylinder. So anyway, that's Richard Winn's very nice 1969 Greeves Griffon. Now this is a bike I spotted at the 2018 Kendall Classic Revival Scramble. Now it's a 1965 250 Challenger, and as old Greeves machines go, this one certainly has that old vintage look. Now the bike looks original, although I never really got any details from the owner on the actual parts on the bike when I took these video clips. The 250 engine, of course, on this particular bike, and as you can see, all the nuts and bolts are wired to stop them coming loose during racing. And once again, an enamel concentric carburetor on this bike, although the exposed foam filter is not stock, if I remember from back in the time. I'm sure there should be an airbox in there somewhere. The gearbox, once again, separate from the engine, although connected via a primary drive chain inside this clutch casing. Now this old vintage bike appears to have kept the original Greeves handlebars and bar clamps. They look quite original from that period. And this Challenger, of course, has the telescopic Italian-made Seriani forks fitted on this bike. If you remember, the previous 1965 bike still had the leading link front suspension on that particular bike, but this bike has kept the original alloy I-beam at the front. Of course, these alloy I-beam frames were a combination between that and this steel chrome molly tubing. Of course, not a fully original bike from 1965, but nevertheless a very nice example of one of these old British Greeves scramblers. Now looks like the levers are also period correct, as are these top and bottom triple clamps. But it's good to see a Greeves machine with these original bars, because these were very good bars for controlling this bike from back in the day. And just a couple of black and white shots there just to give the bike that's its authentic look from 1965, but a very nice example of one of these Challengers. So we've had a look at the bike, so let's just see if we can get this old bike fired up. Oof. Yes. Kicking back. This video was brought to you in association with Wolfsport, the world's #1 supplier for all your off-road and leisure sportswear. Just visit their online website or give them a call for more details.